Chapter 3: The Kind Prince. While the new baby was still very young, his mother, Queen Maya, died. Shortly before she passed away, the queen said to her sister, "Soon I shall not be able to take care of my baby anymore. Dear sister, after I have gone, please look after Siddhartha for me." Her sister promised that she would. She loved the little prince very much, and brought him up as if he were her own child. The prince grew into a bright, handsome, and kind-hearted boy. His father, the king, arranged for him to be educated by the best teachers in the kingdom, and very quickly he showed his remarkable intelligence. After the first few days of classes, the teachers reported to the king. "Your Majesty," they said, "the prince does not need us anymore. After only a few lessons he has learned everything we have to teach him. In fact, he has taught us a few things that we ourselves never knew before." Hearing this, the king's pride in his son grew even greater. "With this intelligence, my son will certainly grow up to be a wise and powerful king," he thought, and this made the king very happy. But there was something else about this boy that was even more remarkable than his intelligence. He had a very kind, gentle, and loving nature. The rest of his young playmates enjoyed the rough and tumble games of small children, or pretended they were soldiers and fought with one another. But Prince Siddhartha quietly spent most of his time alone. He loved the small animals that lived in the palace gardens and became friendly with them all. The animals knew that the prince would never hurt them, so they were not afraid of him. Even the wild animals, who would run away if anyone else came near, came to greet the prince when he entered the garden. They approached him fearlessly and ate from his hand the food he always brought with him for them. One day, as the prince was sitting in the garden, a flock of white swans flew overhead. Suddenly an arrow shot up into the air, striking one of them. It fell out of the sky and landed at the prince's feet, the arrow still stuck into its wing. "Oh, you poor swan," Siddhartha whispered as he gently picked up the wounded bird. "Do not be afraid. I shall take care of you. Here, let me remove this arrow." Then, with one hand he gently stroked the bird, calming its fear. With his other hand he slowly pulled out the painful arrow. The prince was carrying a special lotion with him and softly rubbed it into the bird's wing, all the time speaking in a low, pleasant voice so that the swan would not become afraid. Finally he took off his own silk shirt and wrapped it around the bird to keep it warm. After a short time, another young boy came running into the garden. It was the prince's cousin Devdatta. He was carrying a bow and some arrows, and he was very excited. "Siddhartha, Siddhartha," he shouted. "Great news! I got a swan! You should have seen me. I hit it with my first shot. It fell down somewhere near here. Help me look for it." Then Devdatta noticed one of his arrows, with blood still on its tip, lying on the ground near Siddhartha's feet. Looking closer, he saw that the prince was holding something in his arms, and realized it was the swan he was searching for. "Hey, you took my swan!" he yelled. "Give it back to me! I shot it and it's mine!" Devdatta grabbed at the bird, but Siddhartha held on to it, keeping his angry cousin from even touching the injured creature. "I found this bird lying here bleeding," the prince said firmly, "and I don't plan to give it to anyone while it is still wounded." "But it's mine!" shouted Devdatta again. "I shot it fair and square, and you've stolen it from me. Give it back or I'll take it back." The two boys stood arguing like this for some time. Devdatta was getting angrier and angrier, but Siddhartha refused to give him the swan. Finally, the prince said, "When two grown-ups have a quarrel like this, they settle it in court. In front of a group of wise people, each one explains the story of what happened. Then the wise people decide who is right. I think you and I should do the same." Devdatta did not like this idea very much, but because it was the only way he could get the swan back, he agreed. So the two of them went to the palace and appeared in front of the king and his ministers. The people at the court smiled at each other when they heard what these two children wanted. "To think," they said, "that they want to take up our time over a mere bird." But the king said, "Both Siddhartha and Devdatta are royal princes, and I am glad they brought their quarrel to us. I think it is very important that, as future rulers, they become used to the ways of this court. Let the trial begin." So in turn each of the boys described what happened. Then the ministers tried to decide which boy was right and should therefore have the swan. Some thought, Devdutta shot the bird, therefore it should belong to him. Others thought, Siddhartha found the swan, therefore it should belong to him. And for a long time the ministers talked and argued about the case. Finally, into the court came a very old man whom no one remembered ever seeing before. But because he looked so wise, they told him the story of the boys and their swan. After listening to what they had to say, he declared, Everyone values his or her life more than anything else in the world. Therefore, I think that the swan belongs to the person who tried to save its life, not to the person who tried to take its life away. Give the swan to Siddhartha. Everyone agreed that what the wise man said was true, so they decided to let the prince keep the swan. Later, when the king tried to find the old man and reward him for his wisdom, he was nowhere to be found. This is very strange, the king thought. I wonder where he came from and where he went. But no one knew. This was just one of the many unusual things that happened concerning the prince. So many people thought he must be a very special child indeed. Chapter 4: The Marriage Contest. As the prince grew older, his kindness made him well loved by everyone who knew him. But his father was worried. Siddhartha is too gentle and sensitive, he thought. I want him to grow up to be a great king, and kings must be strong and powerful. But the prince is more interested in sitting by himself in the garden than he is in learning how to be the ruler of a kingdom. I am afraid that my son will soon want to leave the palace and follow the lonely life of holy men like Asita. If he does this, he will never become a great king. These thoughts bothered the king very much. He sent for his most trusted ministers and asked them what he could do. Finally, one of them suggested, O king, your son sits and dreams of other worlds only because he is not yet attached to anything in this world. Find him a wife, let him get married and have children, and soon he will stop dreaming and become interested in learning how to rule the kingdom. The king thought this was an excellent idea. So he arranged for a large banquet at the palace. All the young women from noble families were invited. At the end of the evening, the prince was asked to give presents to each of the guests, while several ministers watched him closely to see which of the young women the prince seemed to like. The women, who were scarcely more than young girls, were all very embarrassed to appear before the prince. He looked so handsome but so distant as he stood in front of the table bearing all the expensive gifts. One by one they shyly went up to him, timidly looking downward as they approached. They silently accepted the jewel or bracelet or other gift, and quickly returned to their places. Finally, only one young woman was left. She was Yashodhara, the daughter of a neighboring king. Unlike the others, she approached the prince without any shyness. For the first time that evening, the young prince looked directly at the woman before him. She was very beautiful, and the prince was immediately attracted to her. They stood in silence for a while, looking into each other's eyes. Then Yashodhara spoke. "O prince, where is the gift for me?" The prince was startled, as if awakening from a dream. He looked down at the table and saw it was empty. All the gifts had already been given out to the other guests. "Here, take this," said the prince, removing his own ring from his finger. "This is for you." Yashodhara graciously accepted the ring and walked slowly back to her place. The ministers saw all that happened and excitedly ran to the king. "Sire," they reported happily, "we have found the perfect bride for the prince. She is Princess Yashodhara, daughter of your neighbor, King Suprabhuta. Let us immediately go to this king and arrange for the marriage of his daughter and your son." King Shuddhodana agreed and soon afterward visited Yashodhara's father. King Suprabhuta greeted him warmly and said, "I am sure that your son is a fine young man, but I cannot give my daughter away to just anyone. Many other princes want to marry her, and they are all excellent young men. They are skilled in riding, archery, and other royal sports. Therefore, if your son wants to marry my daughter, he will have to compete in a contest with the other suitors, as is our custom." And so it was arranged for a great contest to be held, with beautiful Yashodhara as the prize. King Shuddhodana was worried. He thought, "My son has never showed the slightest interest in warrior games. How can he ever win this contest?" But the prince understood his father's fears and said to him, "Do not be worried. I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to win Yashodhara as my bride." The first event was archery. The other men placed their targets a long distance away, yet each was able to hit the bullseye. And when it was Devdutta's turn, for Siddhartha's cousin was also one of the suitors, he not only hit the bullseye, but sent his arrow right through the target until it stuck out the other side. The crowd cheered, but Yashodhara covered her eyes in fright. "How can my beloved Siddhartha ever beat that shot?" she thought. "How dreadful if I had to marry Devdutta!" But the prince was confident. When it was his turn, he had the target placed so far away that most of the people could hardly even see it. Then he took an arrow from his quiver and pulled back on his bow. The prince was so strong, however, that the bow burst in half. He had drawn it back so far. "Please fetch me another bow," the prince asked. "But a much stronger one this time, so it will not break like the other one." Then a minister called out, "O prince, there is a very old bow in the palace. It belonged to one of the greatest warriors of the past. But since he died many years ago, no one has been strong enough to string it, much less shoot it." "I shall use that one," said the prince, and everyone was amazed. When he was handed the bow, he carefully bent it and strung it easily. Then he notched an arrow on the string, drew it back so far that the ends of the bow almost touched, aimed, and let the arrow fly. Twang! The bow made such a loud sound that people in faraway villages heard it. The arrow shot away so fast that when it hit the distant target, right in the center of the bullseye, it did not even slow down, but continued to fly until it was out of sight. The crowd roared in delight. "The prince has won! The prince has won!" But archery was only the first event of the day. The next contest was in swordsmanship. Each young man selected a tree and showed his strength by slashing through it with his sword. One suitor cut through a tree 6 inches thick, another 9 inches, and a third cut through a tree a foot thick with a single stroke of his sword. Then it was the prince's turn. He selected a tree that had 2 trunks growing side by side. He swung his sword so quickly that it cut through the tree faster than anyone could see. His sword was so sharp and his cut so even that the tree did not even fall over. Instead, it remained standing, perfectly balanced. When they saw the tree still standing upright, the crowd and especially Yashodhara moaned, "He has failed." The prince's sword did not even cut into the first trunk. But just then a breeze stirred up and blew over the neatly severed tree trunks. The crowd's moans turned into cheers, and again they shouted, "The prince has won!" The final contest was in horsemanship. A wild horse, which had never been ridden before, was held down by several strong men while each young suitor tried to mount it. But the horse bucked and kicked so furiously that none of them could stay on its back for more than a few seconds. Finally, one young man managed to hold on, and the attendants let go of the horse. But it jumped and lunged about with such fury and anger that the rider was thrown to the ground. And he would have been trampled if the men had not rushed out and pulled him to safety. The crowd began screaming loudly, "Stop the contest! Don't let the prince near that horse! It is too dangerous! The horse will kill him!" But Siddhartha had no fear. "Gentleness can be more powerful than brute strength," he thought, and slowly reached out and took hold of a small tuft of hair that grew from the horse's forehead. Speaking in a low and pleasant voice, and gently stroking the wild horse's head and sides, he calmed its anger, rage, and fear. Soon the horse was so gentle that it began licking Siddhartha's hand. Then, still whispering sweetly to the horse, the prince climbed onto its back. While the crowd roared happily, he paraded the steed in front of the kings and ministers, and bowed low to his fair prize, the lovely Yashodhara. The contest was over. Young Siddhartha had won. And he had done so not only by his great skill and strength, but by his gentleness and kindness as well.